Sorry. I have, and oh, they can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Majid, can you hear me now? Majid or anyone else, can you hear me?
Can you unplug this?
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful.
Yes, we can hear you, but mute yourself. Professor,
Yes, sir.
we can see you now. That's very good. Can you mute yourself while I'm talking? And also, Frank, you are not muted yourself. I can see who is muted and who is not muted.
My dear, my cher. Oh,
And Ronald, have you muted yourself? Yeah, okay, that you are muted. Yes. Okay. I think we are all now there, to be quite honest. Me get this last things done.
merci, merci.
Okay, my very dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, we are now live. And my understanding is about 100 odd people are already watching us, and this is likely to increase as we go on through the conference. I welcome you to this Iran's sponsored virtual conference, which is in parallel to the 45th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And this virtual conference is listed in the HRC events calendar, which is very kind of them, as the actual physical side events cannot at this stage take place within the Palais. But nevertheless, we put it together in association with, of course, Organization of Kashmir Coalition, IPNC, together with ICHR, SACFR, KYA, and International Women's Union. So we are here, and the theme is self-determination, conflict, and Geneva Convention. Obviously, self-determination has been very vital issue within the United Nations sphere and international law. And there are various mentions and other treaties that talk of self-determination under the international law and within the United Nations. But how far self-determination is very prevalent now is a question that we need to ask and answer. After decolonization, it took off very well, but unfortunately, during the process after the Second World War, during the process, it has fallen out altogether. And there are places where we see no sight of right to self-determination. Obviously, this has caused at certain places to lead to conflicts and violent conflicts, to be quite honest. And we are all aware of all those conflicts that, of course, high on the agenda probably comes Palestinian one, which has seen a lot of violence and situation that has deteriorated in many ways the world peace. And then, of course, there is Kashmir, which has seen a lot of violence, and it still is going on. And practically the entire Indian occupied Kashmir is under military siege, as has been under lockdown since 5th August 2019. Then there are soft self-determination issues where there may not be such a grave violence, but resistance movements are there on the spots. And one of them very well can be described as Catalonia, where there is a very strong movement going on. The president of Catalonia, Carles Puigdemont, who is one of the members of the Kashmir group in the European Parliament, is very active on the Catalonian issue. So similar issues such as Ronald Barnes, we will throw light on that. Indeed, Ambassador Ronald Barnes, Alaska is another prime example where it is very much a non-violent self-determination resistance, and then followed by Hawaii, and so many other places all over the world. And if one wants to know full details where self-determination issues are pending, then Alfred Dazai's document, which is commonly known as 69N, he has listed all those nations and unrepresented peoples whose self-determination is there pending. Yes, what are the Geneva Conventions? What do they talk about these conflicts? What do they talk about self-determination? I think we have a great deal of experts today here, and perhaps the most seasoned professor on this is Professor Alfred Maurice Dazais. He is obviously currently with the Geneva School of Diplomacy, and he has been for 6 years independent expert on the promotion of democratic and equitable international order. Prior to that, he was the secretary of the Human Rights Committee at Palais des Nations for about 20 years. So there can't be a better person than him to tell us what the conventions are all about and where we stand in relation to self-determination. He is not physically with us, unfortunately. He is somewhere in the chalet, but he has been kind enough to record his message, video message, which we will now, run now. Professor Alfred Maurice Dazais, his video is coming in a second or so. I think the technical people are trying to work it out. They are in a different room. I see them now coming up. I think any minute it should, or any second it should be live.
Good afternoon. afternoon to all participants in this important side event on the right of self-determination of peoples. It's been my pleasure and honor to share such side events and panels in the past with Barrister Majid Trambu, with Leon Siu, Foreign Minister of the Kingdom of Hawaii, and with Ambassador Ronald Barnes. As you know, back in the year 2014, when I was still the independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order, I issued a report on the theory and practice of self-determination. It was a report to the General Assembly, report A/69/272, and I formulated a number of constructive, implementable, pragmatic recommendations, which of course have not been put into effect. In any event, self-determination is not going away. And my call to Michelle Bachelet as High Commissioner for Human Rights, my call to the Human Rights Council, my call to the Secretary General of the United Nations is that the right of self-determination again be given the priority that it deserves, because it is a conflict prevention strategy. There are many peoples around the world who aspire to self-determination, who have a right to achieve self-determination, whose aspirations are being frustrated not only by colonizing powers, but by occupying powers and by powers who never decolonized. For instance, the indigenous of North and South America were never decolonized, unlike the peoples of Africa and Asia. And the people of Hawaii, they had their kingdom. It was a recognized state in with sovereign state in the community of independent states in the 19th century until 1893, when the United States overthrew the Hawaiian Queen. As you probably know, President Bill Clinton issued an apology to the people of Hawaii in 1993, and that apology recognized the injustices and the illegality of the overthrow. On the other hand, in a disclaimer at the end of the resolution of the US Congress, they say, well, no consequences. You cannot bring claims against the United States on the basis of this resolution. The fact is that you can bring claims, and the international community, for instance, should appeal to the General Assembly, should issue a resolution in the General Assembly calling for a revisiting of the fraudulent procedures that led to the adoption of General Assembly Resolution 1469 of December 1959, when the United States was relieved of its obligations under Chapter 11 of the United Nations Charter, namely Article 73E, which required the United States to report to the General Assembly on the measures taken toward the achievement of self-determination by the native peoples of Alaska and the native peoples of Hawaii. With regard to Kashmir, we have a whole slew of resolutions of the Security Council and of the General Assembly, which have been ignored and violated by India. Now, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has issued important reports concerning the situation in Kashmir, and many of my colleague rapporteurs have appealed to India to, can we say, observe its obligations under these resolutions of the Security Council and General Assembly, and to stop committing grave human rights violations in the territory of occupied Kashmir. Of course, there has been no advance on that. There has been no priority attached to the issues of self-determination. Now, my call to all of you listening and to my colleague participants in this side event is that we all demand of the Human Rights Council that the issue of self-determination be placed once again as a permanent item in the agenda of the Human Rights Council, as I said, because it is a preventative measure. I see in the years and decades to come many conflicts arising in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere because of the denial of the right of self-determination of peoples, which, as you all know, is anchored in the United Nations Charter and is also anchored in Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Article 1, Paragraph 1 says all people have the right of self-determination, not just some of them, and not just those living under occupation or those who have been colonized. All people have this right because of their own dignity. It depends on the concept of human dignity, the concept of one's culture, one's identity, one's traditions. And Article 1, Paragraph 3 imposes a positive obligation on states to do the necessary so that this right of self-determination is, in fact, realized for these peoples. So having a solid legal basis for the achievement of self-determination, I think the ball is on the court of Michelle Bachelet and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and on the court of the members of the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, and the Security Council. I think there's no justification to delay the realization of such a fundamental right, which is as fundamental as the right to life. I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for that very informative presentation by Alfred Zais. Obviously, the second message from him is the self-determination is not going to go away. General Assembly must pass a resolution on this, and it should be reintroduced as a permanent agenda item at the Human Rights Council agenda as a permanent item over there. And obviously identities need to be maintained, preserved, whether it is social, cultural, or ethnicity. Thank you very much, Alfred. Now let's go to some of the specific issues of self-determination. And I think first we will go to Asia. Alfred spoke quite a lot about Kashmir in his presentation. Let's see what Professor Nazir Ahmad Shaul has to say about it. Professor Nazir Ahmad Shaul is a very close associate of mine. Both of us come from Kashmir, and that part of Kashmir which is under the Indian occupation. Professor is a writer, a poet, and above all, he is a human rights activist and a very formidable leader of the organization of Kashmir Council. Professor, the floor is yours, please.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Barrister Srambu, for hosting this seminar as this sideline event. My dear distinguished panelists and friends who are participating in this sideline event and listening to us, I will not touch the legalities of the issue because I am not a legal expert. But at the same time, there are human dimensions to every problem. And I'll be referring to these dimensions very briefly. A look at the global arena clearly reveals the painful reality that there are many conflict areas with echoes of pain and agony, denial and deprivation, social injustices, draconian laws, lockdowns, and overriding undemocratic structures. There are areas in the world where people desire to become the masters of their destiny, and the underlying predicament and the principle for any self-governance is self-determination. You are listening to the erudition of Dr. Alfred Zayas, and he has rightly pointed out that self-determination is the best conflict preventing strategy that needs to be heeded by those who have to maintain the global peace and who have to foster peaceful coexistence. I come from a place called Kashmir, which is illegally occupied by India. And in the eyes of the world, India is the largest democracy. But here I would like to quote the former Prime Minister of India, Mr. Manmohan Singh. He, in his speech to the United States Congress during his visit to the United States, when describing the democracy, he said, the real test of the democracy is not what is said in the Constitution, but also in how it functions on ground. However, with greatest soldier to civilian ratio in the world and a catalog of documented human rights abuses, it is fair to say that people of Kashmir contest the legitimacy of the present government in occupied Kashmir. And this state of affairs has not been manufactured by third party, as India claims, is born out of disillusionment that follows the oppressed rule. The present scenario in Kashmir has been architected systematically ever since the PM Modi-led government assumed office in New Delhi. This government brought about a metamorphosis in the policy of governance. This policy is militaristic and muscular. There exists no democratic space for any form of dissent, and entire population has been made a hostage. They are feeling choked by military oppression. On 5th August 2019, India launched a full-fledged aggression to fracture the state of Jammu and Kashmir and break it into two union territories, J&K and Ladakh. This breakup is to absorb the territory into Indian Union and bring about a demographic change. This is in violation of international law and illegal unilateral action contrary to the UN mandate on this disputed territory. It also violates the specific UN resolutions promoting Kashmiris to exercise their right of self-determination. The subject of right of self-determination is one, despite the long association with getting rid of people's subjugation and working for the people of the world who were and still are deprived of exercising that right of self-determination freely. It is a long denial of that right, which to a layman's language is nothing else than the right to freedom, and in this case, freedom of the people of Kashmir. If human rights and democracy are universal values, why should the standards vary from nation to nation and from state to state? Moral values, if preached, should maintain level of equality and justice for all. The peoples of the world, otherwise they lose significance. That is what is happening in the changing times. Universal values are not being practiced with a universal standard demanding equality and justice. By virtue of the principle of equal rights and self-determination of the peoples enshrined in the Charter of United Nations, all the people have the right to freely determine without external interference and their political status and to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And every state has a duty to respect this right in accordance with the provisions of the ethos, the establishment of sovereign and independent state, or the emergence into any other political status freely determined by a people constitute modes of implementing right to self-determination by that people. It is also undisputed that Article 4 of the Protocol of the Fourth Geneva Convention 1949 extends the traditional definition of armed conflict to include armed conflict in which people are fighting against colonial domination, alien occupation, or racist regimes in the exercise of their right to self-determination. It is an uncontested fact that people of J&K are validly exercising their right to self-determination against a communal, racist, fascist, and oppressive regime. In his report, we were listening to Dr. Alfred Zayas, and I am reminded of the report that he presented to the United Nations General Assembly. And Alfred Zayas states at paragraph 69N, and I quote, "The General Assembly may consider revisiting the reality of self-determination in today's world and refer to the Special Committee of Decolonization or the other United Nations communications by indigenous and unrepresented people wherever they reside, inter alia in Kashmir, with reference to Chapter 11 of the Charter of United Nations. The General Assembly may also consider amending its rules and procedures to allow the participation of indigenous and undisputed people." My dear friends, before I conclude, I would like to give you a glimpse of governance as has been already documented by International Tribunal for Peace and Justice. And they classify the governance in Kashmir as the Indian state governance of occupied Kashmir requires the use of discipline and death as techniques of social control. The structure of governance affiliated with militarization in Kashmir necessitates dispersed and intense forms of psychosocial regulation. India's objective has been to discipline and assimilate Kashmir into its territory. To do so has required the domestication of Kashmiri people through the selective use of discipline and death as regulatory mechanism. Discipline is effected through military presence, surveillance, punishment, and fear. Death is disbursed through extrajudicial means and those authorized by law. Psychosocial control is exercised through the use of death and deception to discipline the living. Discipline rewards forgetting, isolation, and depoliticization. My dear friends, this is all being done to deprive the people of Kashmir of their self-determination. And I hope that this seminar will take notice of these gross violations and demand from the United Nations to exercise its preventive diplomacy and to protect the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Of course, Kashmir is very close to your heart. And indeed, what you speak is always with your heart in it. And of course, your mind is always focusing on Kashmir. It's very unfortunate whatever is happening there. As I said in my opening, it's a violent territory where self-determination is a very ripe, and international community need to come to Kashmiri's rescue. We move on now to another panelists and another area of self-determination. Daniela Dongis, I hope I got the name right. I personally know Daniela for a very long time. I've seen her always very active, very superb within the spheres of Geneva, and in particular at the Palais des Nations, at the United Nations. A very strong human rights person, following Middle East in particular, Asia in general, and Middle East in particular, with urge, and particularly on the issue of Palestine. Daniela Dongis is also a CPS program coordinator at the University of Geneva. My very dear colleague and friend, Daniela, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay, yes, thanks everybody for the invitation to participate in this panel. It's a great honor, and I'm happy to see some of you online. We usually met in Geneva in person. So I'm glad to see all of you. For those who don't know me, my background is that I've been working on Asia and Middle East since many, many years, particularly on Palestine. I've always been very active on Palestine. However, since 2018, I've been living and working in Palestine for an NGO working in the framework of the German Civil Peace Service. So I've been there for 2 years on the ground. And although I've always been working on Palestine and I knew about what's going on the ground, the extent of the human rights violations and the systematic expulsion and the attempts of the Israeli state to change the demographic structure of the Palestinian territories, this has only become clear on the ground. The case of Palestine is the classic example of the denial of the right to self-determination. And those who know me is that usually I start my talks with a presentation and then picture about the division of the West Bank into area A, B, and C, and just to illustrate the loss of self-determination by the Palestinian people, let me just sum it up. So at the following the Oslo Accords, the occupied Palestinian territories have been divided into area A, B, and C, and only 18% currently are under the control of the Palestinian authorities, which is the major cities like Bethlehem, Ramallah, Hebron, and 60% of the West Bank are under full control of Israel. B is mixed. So at the moment, since a while, there was always a security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian authorities in Area C. This has ended since a couple of months, and I will talk about it later. But actually, I was asked to talk about the Geneva Conventions and how they are violated with regards to Palestine. And of course, what is most known are the illegal settlements. Article 49 of the Geneva Conventions, which is applicable and has been confirmed by the hycotractic parties in 2001 to be applicable, prohibits for an occupying power to transfer parts of its own population to areas it occupies. Nevertheless, over the years, Israel has transferred about 670,000 settlers to the Palestinian territories and East Jerusalem, and these mainly the best areas and the most fruitful areas. So these settlements are illegal. They are built on Palestinian lands with a number of human rights violations towards the Palestinian people, maybe checkpoints or movement restrictions, land grab. They don't have access to their own land. It has a tremendous impact on the Palestinian people. And if you drive from the north to the south of the West Bank and you see how the settlements are scattered all over the West Bank, you see that they're basically, it's the attempt to make a two-state solution impossible and exercise total control over the Palestinian people. Another issue we have to talk about is the issue of house demolitions. Personally, I've been present in the occupied territories, and I've seen a number of house demolitions, and I've been sitting together with families whose houses have been demolished. Article 33 of the Geneva Convention prohibits collective punishment, and Article 53 prohibits any destruction of property prohibited except in totally exceptional circumstances. None of this is respected by the Israeli authorities. The main justifications to demolish houses is that they claim that Palestinians have no building permit. However, in areas that are fully controlled by Israel, Palestinians just don't get building permits even on their own land. So in the end, they are forced to build without a permit, and then the bulldozers arrive. So I've been present when this happened, and it's heartbreaking when you see the pain and suffering of the families whose house is demolished in front of their eyes. We just had demolitions in Yatta, south of Hebron. We have in Al-Walaja, where our office has been located, there have been demolition orders against about 180 houses. And currently there is a case of 38 houses that Israel is planning to demolish anytime soon, which is still in court, but Israel is pushing to demolish these 38 houses. So you can imagine the pain and suffering. Other houses are demolished as punishment because one family member is accused of a so-called terrorist act, if it's proven or not. And many times these houses are blown up, which is also totally forbidden under the Geneva Convention. Article 147 of the Fourth Geneva Convention also calls among grave breaches against persons the killing, torture, and inhumane treatment of people. And as you may know, Palestinian lives are cheap. Israeli soldiers and settlers are heavily armed and control the entire West Bank. And whenever a Palestinian is killed, usually there is the pretext that he had been planning an attack or whatever, but Amnesty International has clearly pointed out that this is trigger happy and totally excessive use of force. Some may recall the case of Iyad Halak, a disabled Palestinian who has been shot a few months ago in East Jerusalem while he was just walking through the city. The incident had been recorded by security cameras. When the military was asked to investigate the case, suddenly they, the material was lost or wasn't clear enough. So Israel, unfortunately, is getting away with murder. And this in many cases where there is absolutely no proof for lethal danger to anybody. They use excessive violence, and this has to be called murder. When we talk about torture and inhumane treatment, I want to talk about the son of a friend of mine. His name is Hamouda Tamimi, who has already been in jail a number of times, and he was arrested about a year and a half ago. And instead of being brought to a normal court, he was interrogated by the Secret Service. And his mother later told me that sometime when she finally was allowed to visit her son, she saw him, and her mother came, his grandmother also came for the visit. His son was so disturbed that he didn't recognize his own grandmother anymore. So much psychological damage had to be done to him. With regards to the prisoners, we also have to talk about breaches against Article 49 and 76, forcible transfer. Article 76 says that protected persons shall be detained in occupied countries. Nevertheless, in the majority of the cases, Palestinian prisoners are transferred outside the occupied territories and held inside Israel, which has huge implications for their families. The families don't get a permit to visit their family members. This leads to tremendous human suffering. And this has happened to a dear friend also of mine. Her name is Hatem. And her son Hatem has been arrested for no reason after the second Intifada. He was a brilliant student. He studied chemistry, and probably because he was brilliant, that's at least the assumption by the family as well, arrested him and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. He has been transferred to a prison inside Israel against the Geneva Convention, and his mother is almost never or very rarely able to see him. And when you meet her, this is an amazing lady, and the suffering this causes to family members and mothers, I don't have the words to describe it, and I'm feeling with this mother. So this son was arrested after the second Intifada, illegally in breach of Geneva Conventions, transferred to the Israeli territories. Few days after his arrest, Hatem was waken up in the middle of the night. The family was taken out of their house, and they still wondered what was happening because they were still confused and disturbed by the arrest of their son. And when the soldiers brought them away, and when they came back, their house had been blown up without any previous warning. So much as punitive demolitions. When we also talk about Palestinian prisoners who are whose cases are handled in front of military courts instead of civil courts, these prisoners are abused, humiliated. Children from the age of 12 on can be arrested without presence of lawyers, parents, or anything. They are forced to sign false statements. The extent of the abuse of Palestinian people and also the arbitrary arrests is hard to describe. Since end of June, there have been 4,279 detainees, and some of them in administrative detention, which happened to a friend of mine. His name is Mohammed Zrayer. He was falsely accused of terrorist affiliations. I personally vouch for him. I know he is absolutely unviolent and is not involved in any violent activities. He has been in and out of prison for a number of times, always administrative detention without accusation, just they hold them for investigation. And he has now again been in jail since April. So his family and friends are calling really to release him, and there is nothing they can do because there are no accusations. Our friend Isa Amr, who all of you know is a famous human rights defender, is waiting for the outcome of his trial anytime soon, and he may be sentenced to several years in prison for being a very famous human rights defender who is following Gandhi. Just to conclude, I want to talk about the current situation because many of you may have heard about the annexation that was announced by the Israeli government. It was announced for the 1st of July, then following international criticism, it was postponed and again. And recently there were these peace agreements by several Arab states based on the claim by Israel that they would halt the annexation. What I can tell you on the ground, the annexation is accelerating and speeding up even without formal annexation. And there are no international observers at the moment on the ground, so Israel is doing this with impunity. What's the result? Under COVID-19, plus the occupation, plus the speeding up of the annexation, the de facto annexation, Palestinian people have nothing to eat anymore in their fridge. They live from tourism, from the Palestinian authorities, or they work inside Israel with a lockdown. They have no income anymore, and literally the fridges are empty. We have armed family disputes, burglaries, killings are on the rise. So you feel the tension rising at the moment and the despair rising. And for me, as an external observer, an escalation may be imminent anytime soon, and that would risk the entire region. And this is in line with what Alfred says, that self-determination and the denial of self-determination is a reason for conflicts around the world. And that's the reason why we have to end them. Thank you.
Daniela, thank you for that very great presentation. I'm moved by really the situation, what you described in occupied territory of Palestine, whether it is in terms of settlers, that means the demographic change, and that seems the modern trend around the world to change the demography of the area where people are asking for freedom or asking for self-determination. Obviously about house destructions for whatever reasons, and torture and other physical human rights abuses, and what's happening with the prisoners and the current situation with regard to the annexations which is proceeding, nevertheless with impunity. And of course, very helpful, the relevant articles of the Geneva Conventions which you identified. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, Daniela. Thank you. Now we move on to the great personality and a very dear comrade of mine, who is nevertheless or nonetheless with the pandemic going on around the world, and obviously Geneva is no exception, but he has been working during this COVID-19 pandemic within the Palais day in and day out, not only on the cause which is very dear to his heart and for which he is fighting day and night, not only within the Palais, but all over the world through his very strong written and oral contributions. Ambassador Ronald Barnes is a great personality and really on the ground in Geneva doing wonderful job. He represents the state of Alaska, and I'm sure he will also talk about Hawaii in solidarity with the foreign minister of Hawaii, our great friend, another great friend, Leon Seo, and a wonderful combination really in pursuit of right to self-determination around the world. Ambassador Barnes, you are the hero and you have the floor.
Thank you for that intervention. And it's good to be friends with you and everyone here on this panel. Of course, Alaska was listed in 1946 with the right to self-determination under principles that were derived and are based on principles of the Geneva Conventions dating back to 1874 and perhaps earlier. Of course, the 1907 Hague Regulations, and then, of course, the Geneva Conventions that evolved and were more defined in the 1940s. I don't claim to be an expert. I've only read about this, and I've conferred, of course, with Alfred, our great professor, Alfred de Zayas, an independent expert formerly, who continues to be our great friend. There was a group of individuals from Alaska who came here before the end of the 20th century and asked, without obtaining any kind of formal declaration from an official body, about the Geneva Conventions, and were told they do not apply to Alaska. What I'm discovering is that is false and misleading. And if anyone asserts this, they should provide who were the experts or people who said that, and what official court or UN body had determined this, because from my study and even confirmation from other experts, they do apply to Alaska. So just to point out, Alaska and Hawaii were removed in 1959 from the list of non-self-governing territories without proper participation of the indigenous peoples of Alaska, through irregular voting procedures, with no United Nations monitoring by an official mission from United Nations, and without implementation of United Nations guidelines and procedures under General Assembly resolutions. And according even to experts of the subcommission who were going to grant the resolution on Alaska, they stated that the Constitution of the United States was violated, and also the international legal obligations. So the United States is sitting on nothing. When you look at who actually voted, it was the United States military who were granted the right to vote, and their descendants, and also American citizens. And so when you look at also the Supreme Court decisions, which Alfred de Zayas pointed out in a memo that he wrote in 2018, he said there's apartheid in Alaska. And when we were discussing the denial of the right of the Alaska tribes to participate equally in decision-making in this 2020 period where the pandemic issues came alive full front, what was stated, and we made clear through this memo, and I'm going to read to you, the United States Supreme Court instituted doctrines of superiority and racial discrimination in law and policy by the Teton v. United States of America of 1955, making it clear in footnote 18 that, quote, this purpose and acquisition and its effect on land held by the natives was distinguished from the settlement of the white race in the United States, where the dominant purpose of the whites in America was to occupy the land. Further, the Teton judgment relies on the precedent of the Johnson v. McIntosh case of 1823, which held that the character and religion of native inhabitants of America justified, quote, considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. So what the United States Supreme Court said is the superior genius of Europe is greater than ours, and so they employed doctrines of superiority over us. Of course, when you look, and I'll give you two examples, General Assembly Resolution 644 from 1952, and then 1328, which says also the same as 644, that all discriminating law and policy is supposed to be abrogated. This was not analyzed. So at the same time that resolutions, the situation of Namibia, which today is Namibia, formerly Southwest Africa, and of course the apartheid in the Union of South Africa, which is now the Republic of South Africa, the apartheid there, and of course former Rhodesia and Zimbabwe, they had law and policy in place which instituted puppet governments and denied any participation or consent. We wrote, and what we discovered is this: if you juxtapose the laws that were put in place at the time in one of these countries, I'll read you the paragraph from a document we're working on. In 1934, Indian Reorganization Act was created by the United States Congress and administered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, formerly called the Department of War. the United States Congress began legalizing legislative and institutional apartheid in the continental United States for the indigenous tribal governments. When one parallels the 1953 Bantu Education Act, created in South Africa and placed under the Minister of Native Affairs to implement the apartheid segregation laws, the same law and policies were also being implemented in Southwest Africa, Namibia, and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. The juxtaposition of the development of the same framework of law and policy makes an even match from South Africa to North America. Of course, what Alfred Desai states, as is well recognized, that the denial of the right to self-determination on grounds of racial discrimination and apartheid is well recognized as crimes against humanity. So when they institute puppet governments, what I wanted to make sure that I brought up, and this was put in the 2006 Shadow report to the Human Rights Committee on the implementation of the ICCPR. And I want to quote what came out of the judgment based on the occupation, the German occupation of Greece. It says, on the contrary, these governments are based on the consent and the military power of the invader. From those, they will derive their power, which could be exercised only an essential condition of such exercise within the limits of military interest and political objectives of the occupant. And they make it very clear here, further stating that with regard to puppet governments, their first and most prominent feature is that they are in no way related to the legal order of the occupied state. In other words, they are neither its government nor its organ of any sort, and they do not carry on its continuity. It follows that any confusion between a puppet government and a de facto government of the occupied state is as inadmissible as confusion between the occupying power itself and a de facto government. This next phrase is very important. On the contrary, puppet governments are organs of the occupant and as such form part of his legal order. The agreements concluded by them with the occupant are not genuine international agreements, however correct in form. Failing a genuine contracting party, such agreements are merely decrees of the occupant disguised as agreements which the occupant in fact concludes with himself. So with the installed puppet governments, the IRA governments in Alaska and other forms of very subjugated, dominated, and exploited and reduced in their recognition so that they cannot interact with what was characterized as a racist apartheid regime by Karen Brown of the Courthouse News in Portland, when they were examining a complaint to the Alaska Commission on Human Rights. In examining what the memo, what Alfred put forth, it's the first time in history that a journalist from the United States of America characterized the situation in Alaska as an apartheid racist regime. So now we have this, and we can challenge Reuters, we can challenge all the newspapers in the United States, we can challenge CNN, and all those major journalists, whether they be television, newspaper, or now with the internet, these other forms of media. Why can't you do the same and to report on this form of occupation that we're under? Now, to get to the situation of Alaska, of course, we are asserting that the United Nations granted to the United States an apartheid regime, And if you look at the deliberations that were recorded from the Committee on Information, which was considered the Decolonization Committee in 1959, you will see that the African states accused the European states and the United States of America of being democratic, fascist, or despotic governments. That this is, you're not going to do this to Africa. We have too many territories in Africa to decolonize. Therefore, you can do this here. And the only reason you're doing it is because you are offering a gift of Alaska and Hawaii to United States, because United States was instrumental in defeating the Axis powers and the German SS and its regime during World War II. So they spared no punches when it came, and I can imagine what was not recorded, because if we can see some of this on the record, what was not recorded was the objections that you will not do this to the many African territories and peoples who have yet to be decolonized. Now, as far as the Geneva Conventions, what I will do is mention some of the principles under the Geneva Conventions and reason why it would apply to Alaska. Geneva Conventions do recognize tribal authority as governing authority. Geneva Conventions do not need a declaration of war for a conflict to exist. The use of surrogate military force or mercenaries or other forms of aggression to exercise control over a people's need not be direct military force, but it can be just that, the surrogate military force. And the use of puppet governments is well recognized in the military manuals of United States or of Great Britain. And there is a way that under the Geneva Conventions that puppet government should be dealt with. The issue of sacred trust obligation to the peoples and to the population for them to maintain their health and their well-being, and also their basic elements of governing authority do exist. The property rights are to be respected, and we were working with our friend from Hawaii, Ruth Boulay, who was successful in declaring that the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom persist despite the occupation of the United States and the creation of the state of Hawaii. Of course, as I said, civilian populations need to be protected, and this goes for everyone, for all of us all over the place in Kashmir, in Alaska, where they attempt to deprive us of our right to subsistence. We have the right to assert our subsistence laws and our laws that protect us against exploitation and that will reduce or to create irreparable harm and damage to our environment. I will bring two examples. There's one in Bristol Bay where they're attempting to create the Pebble Mine with the largest salmon producing wild stock in the world, where I was born and raised. And what they're doing there is they're attempting to create a mine the size of Manhattan. And in this, they would like to extract rare earth minerals, diamonds, gold, using all forms of extractive fluids that will create irreparable harm to the water and to the salmon and to the small salmon that are developing in our region. So we are against Pebble Mine, which this Trump administration has been promoting. We are also against the ANWR development of oil. And we also assert that the development of oil in Alaska is a clear violation of our right to self-determination and right to permanent sovereignty over our natural resources. When we, and we'd like to thank also, of course, Alfred de Zayas for his 69N, which Professor Schall read out, which was very good. And also, if you look at 69M, he called that we must pursue or to promote for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice concerning our cases. And what we've been asserting here, right here directly at the Palais des Nations, I did an intervention on this creation of an expert mechanism for the right to development, where we can begin to bring up racism, racial discrimination, and apartheid and other forms of foreign occupation. So there's opportunities growing for us to bring here directly into. So, okay, Majid is motioning that perhaps I should close my statement, but what I will say is we continue.
That's all I'm saying.
Okay,
Yes.
but what do we want right now? We have the next Universal Periodic Review coming up on November 9th. We want recommendations to annul General Assembly Resolution 1469. And along with a member of the subcommission said, we have the right to pursue an observer seat in the United Nations like Palestine, because Alaska and Hawaii cases are so strong, we have the right to come and pursue this and exercise diplomatic powers. And this is what we would like. So thank you, Majid. Thank you for facilitating this.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Barnes. Very comprehensive analysis of Alaska and to a certain extent about Hawaii. And of course, your reference to Professor Alfred de Zayas's document, which is a very, very great document and a very helpful document. And of course, identification of the various Geneva Conventions, which is very helpful and which is going to be of some importance to all the self-determination issues. Now we have two great experts with us. Frank, we would have wanted to have your face throughout on the screen, but we had your keyboard instead. So it's a live stream. I think people wanted to see your face as against your keyboard, but you are still, if you could bring down the screen of your laptop so that your face will come a bit better, because it's only halfway. Now we have two experts. We heard three different areas of the world. And you heard from those experts on those particular situations. Now we have two independent experts besides Alfred de Zayas, whom we heard right at the beginning. And we would now wish to hear from them on very much definitive on self-determination and conflict and Geneva Conventions. And of course, my another very dear friend is Dr. Joseph Ronca. He's a professor of social works at Springfield College, and has been throughout a very active participant, not only participant, activist at the United Nations. Firstly at Geneva, now he is at New York, and I apologize, Dr. Joseph Ronca, for putting on the first poster as at Geneva, but we corrected it, and I'm sure you have noticed that we put it at New York. But you are everywhere, whether it is New York, whether it is Geneva, whether it is somewhere else. You are everywhere. You are a great supporter of the social justice. You are a great supporter of self-determination, and of course, great human rights defender and activist. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you, Majid. Boy, those were kind words. I appreciate them. And I also appreciate your commitment and follow through, and the commitment and follow through of everyone in this group. It's a pleasure to hear some of the wonderful things you're doing. It was Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, United States Supreme Court Justice, who said, "The greatest dangers to liberty lurk in insidious encroachment by men," or women, let me add, they're getting into it lately, "of men of zeal, well-meaning but understanding. Teaching courses in the helping and health professions, social work, while living in the Arctic region of Alaska." I guess I'm going to further talk about some of the issues in Alaska and then some, reaffirming what my friend Ambassador Ronald Barnes has said. "I taught in a place called Kotzebue, which is a peninsula, a predominantly Eskimo or Inupiat town. I don't know if Eskimo is politically correct these days. Called in Inupiaq Kikitagran, meaning like an island. When I was there, it was certainly a victim of colonization. It had some of the highest incidences of violence per capita in the United States. Suicide rates roughly 10 times higher than white cities. Alcoholism rates as high as 80%. Their indigenous bodies not accustomed to the elixirs of the European settlers. I saw many people prone to what is called idiosyncratic intoxication, their bodies shaking after only a few drinks. It's amazing. And scales had formed on their skins after a bout of drinking. It was as if they were drinking arsenic, their bodies just not accustomed to it. The helping and health professions were well-meaning, I think, and there were good and solid people working in them. But I think they were without understanding, echoing Brandeis's wisdom. I remember once a student who said to me, "We used to go hunting and fishing, gathering berries, leading a subsistence lifestyle, but now they make things too easy for us. All we do is get a welfare check, go to the local store to buy groceries with food stamps. We have lost our subsistence lifestyle." Another student who, after having had to learn, forced, Aristotle's taxonomy of plants and animals, remember that from Biology 101, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, spoke to me with quiet desperation, with a tone of anger in his words. He said he used to spend hours talking with his uncle on the porch on a summer evening about the names of various kinds of birds and animals that would pass by, names he learned in Eskimo, and with sadness he had forgotten those words, and none of those names were entertained at least once in biology classes. I would imagine if he brought them up, he would have gotten a few laughs. I don't know what it is. Every time I quote an indigenous leader, people have, like Crazy Horse or Sitting Bull, people have smiles on their face. I don't get it. I think they call that racism. While these instances might seem small in the scheme of things, and you might wonder, are they even related to this side event of self-determination, conflicts, and Geneva Conventions, more grandiose ideas, so to speak? They certainly were not insignificant to the lived experiences of those living in the Arctic and those impressionable students that had to continually deal with the onslaughts of imperialism and colonialism. And let me add, there is a movement to decolonize the helping and health professions, and I'm happy to be part of it. Indeed, those instances, and indeed there are many others, were microcosms of a broader and more pernicious issue, I would say, that were violations of the right to self-determination, enshrined in numerous human documents, including international conventions, which also have the status of treaty, as Alfred de Zayas mentioned, the UN Charter, the ICCPR, Civil and Political Rights, and the International Convention on Economic and Social Rights, Article 1, which, at least in the United States, in its Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, those treaties, once ratified, ought to become law of the land, and the judges bound thereby. I'd like to note at this time that the word determination comes from the Latin determinare, which means to enclose, to bound, strongly suggesting that there are individuals and groups that have their own myriad ways of being that, simply put, bind them together. We must be respectful of their social bonds and cohesion. I would like to define here further this right to self-determination as stated by Indigenous scholar Natalie Cisneros. The right to be recognized as an autonomous nation with international status, free from paternalistic intervention by settler state governments. The discourse on native self-governance suggests that self-determination can best be realized through native-centered practices. Indeed, in Mohawk, self-determination means living nicely together. And as Erica Dias, former special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people, said, governments have nothing to fear from the right to self-determination. I'd like to interject here with the words of St. John Paul II, former Pope, who said that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the authoritative definition of human rights standards, ought to be lived in letter and in spirit. True, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not include the words self-determination, or that one word. But it was later adopted, as mentioned earlier, by the ICCPR and the ICESCR, which in essence further expanded upon rights found in the Universal Declaration. However, it is important to note that an article on the protection and fate of minorities, briefly, which was to, quote, protect the rights of ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities, inter alia, to establish and maintain their schools and cultural or religious institutions, and to use their own language and script in the press and public assembly, was initially proposed, I believe, by Panama, but then it was dropped after 3 meetings of the drafting committee of the Universal Declaration. France said, we don't need that because the equality of men, women weren't recognized at the time, is already stated in the in Article number 1, that everyone has a right to human dignity. And the rights of minorities, according to France, were for a large part already covered. Haiti, however, a longtime colony of that European giant, struck back. And let me mention here that the word conflict, the major theme of this event, is from the Latin confligere, which means to strike. They struck back and they proposed that the Subcommission on the Protection of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities should study the question of a more binding international convention to ensure effective protection of minorities. Thus, we would include Kashmir, Palestine, and Alaska, certainly, and in other indigenous groups, West Papua, for example. Haiti's proposal was accepted, but to this date, we do not have a fully fledged convention on the right to self-determination, though the closest we have come to it, I believe, is UN DRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous peoples. Now, as a general rule, declarations have lesser juridical force, simply put powers than conventions, which are also known as treaties in state law, which shows that the struggles of the victims, and victim is plausibly from the Latin vincere, the victims of, meaning to conquer, they were the conquered ones, that the victims of colonialization and imperialism continues to be ever present. Now look, as I'm a professor, so I could tell you, I could go on and on. I don't know if you have 3 hours to spare, but in fairness to my colleagues and audiences, and I guess to deflate my own ego, my students in Alaska said I had white man's disease. You know what that is, right? I think they said it endearingly. I don't know. And they also called me an ulugmi. I don't know if that's endearing or what. The color of seal intestine is white, so they called me that. I don't know. Maybe it's pejorative. White man's disease is someone who talks with big words, goes on, carries big books. And I think it was said endearingly. So I don't want to have my disease flow over into 3 hours here. So what I'd like to do now is to conclude with 3 points. They're not as profound, I would say, as Wilson's 14 points, and Wilson was a strong proponent of the right to self-determination. But they're 3 points nevertheless. So here are Ranke's 3 points with commentary. 1, harking back to the Pope's statement, we need to treat in a lived and experiential way every person everywhere with human dignity, which is a crucial notion in Article 1. That is, and in brief, we must not relate to others and people that have been victims of colonization in condescending ways, as if we are the keepers of wisdom, doing things to help those poor minorities, but that we are partakers and sharers in their struggles, as it says in the good book. In brief, my point is human rights, if done correctly, is a way of life to treat others with human dignity. Okay. Second point, I'd like to reflect further upon Article 2 of the Universal Declaration, what has been referred to as its non-discrimination clause. We should not discriminate on the basis, inter alia, I like that word, among other things, on the basis of race, color, language, religion, political opinion, national, social origin, birth, or other status. Here I emphasize indigenous peoples, kind of continuing with what Ambassador Barnes did. Well, those are my experiences, particularly in the Inupiat of Alaska. But I think we need to get more disaggregated data and see further how this powerful idea of self-determination can be applied to other groups. Groups that have somehow bound together, determination from the Latin determinare, to bound, with similar values. You have to look at other groups. Remember, we're in this together. It's human rights for every person everywhere, such as African Americans. I know some of you are aware of the Black Lives Movement in the States, refugees, women, certainly religious minorities, and I think Kashmir is one example, and those speaking languages that are nearly extinct, and that's a big issue these days, and also those in extreme poverty that have their own values and ideas. And also I'd like to add GLBTI. After all, the Universal Declaration in Article 2 says other status. So I think gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexuals, and intersexed, perhaps this idea of self-determination can be applied to that group. I know that in some countries, they apparently still give the death penalty to them. And I went to a side event in Geneva at one point, and the side event said, this is all within open purview of the Vatican. I don't know. My last point, I simply want to conclude that we all reflect upon the words of Gandhi, who, as you know, is a strong proponent of self-determination and got killed for that reason, actually, who, when asked what he thought of Western civilization, he said, that's a good idea. So let's reflect on how we can have Western civilization. It's a great idea. And I would recommend that we do it with the spirit of Crazy Horse, the spirit of peace, humility, and everlasting love, which is what I think human rights is about. That's it. How much did I go? 3 hours? No. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Simply astonishing presentation, to be quite honest. And just to summarize, I think it is in one sentence: self-determination is living nicely together. And of course, your final 3 thoughts of UDHR and Gandhi's words are simply amazing. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Joseph. I'm very, very grateful to you. Now, my next expert, how can I describe him other than what is written on the flyer, simply saying co-founder of the German Green Party and former member of the European Parliament? But he's much bigger than that. Frank Schwalbe-Hoth. I met him first. Do you remember when, Frank? I do remember. It was somewhere in September 2003. Is that correct, Frank? So that means more than 17 years. We have been not only friends, not only brothers, we have been together to fight injustice wherever it exists in the world. But above all, he has been a pioneer of the Kashmir situation in the European Union. This is why you see behind him the European Union flag. He is such a great personality within the European Union that anything you need to know about the European Union, including the Parliament, the Council, or the Commission, here is the man. A man with total dedication to human rights. A man who has given his entire life to the green revolution of the world, to the climate change of the world, to the all sorts of atrocities we are doing to the nature of the world. He has fought it throughout his life. Really, Frank, I have known very closely, and I have worked with him very closely. And his indispensable work on the Kashmir cause is simply unmatchable. And I'm great to have him as my, not only comrade, as I said, as my associate, as my fighter to get justice, and above all, a very, very humble and nice human being. Frank, it's all for you. We can't hear you. I think unmute yourself. No, you are still muted. I can see you are still muted. Yes,
Oh,
come on, go
wow.
on. I think Frank. Okay.
Wow,
Okay.
wonderful. Thank you. What an incredible introduction. Thank you, Majid. Greetings from Brussels. I'm sitting here in the European Parliament, while about 300 meters away, are meeting the 27 presidents and prime ministers of the member states of the European Union, discussing in the moment China, Turkey, Belarus, COVID-19 and other things. I'm sitting in the European Parliament, which is a place where Kashmir is a part of the political activities and even identity of the European Parliament. Because, as Majid mentioned, 17 years ago, we started with activities in Brussels, in the European Parliament, especially on Kashmir, which resulted that the European Parliament recognized the right of self-determination of the people of Kashmir and insisted, in case there are negotiations between Pakistan and India, that the Pakistani has to sit at the same table as third partner. And the last expression of this attitude in the European Parliament was a letter sent by members of the European Parliament to the United Nations this summer, asking the United Nations cannot stand besides the United Nations, have to intervene and to insist in the issue of Kashmir. The reason of this commitment of the European Parliament is that we are the only parliament in the world with more than 200 political parties. They're working in 7 political families, 7 political groups. But these 705 members of the European Parliament are not guided by the interest of the European Union. The general agreement is we are here guided by certain values, universal values, which are the basis of the identity and of our activities. Therefore, in the last years, every year, 3, 4, 5, 6 events on Kashmir took place, and UNPO, UNPO, the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, is regularly doing events here on other unrepresented nations and peoples. When I came here to the European Parliament, outside, a lot of police, a lot of limousines, a lot of police for the Council of the 27 member states of the European Union. Inside the European Parliament, it's nearly dead. And I've never seen it before in 36 years. Why? Because of the COVID-19 restrictions. About 90% of the politicians, assistants, general staff and others are not working in the parliament. They're working from home, following the debates and even virtually voting. That is not for Kashmir or self-determination. This is a difficult aspect. Why? Because the discussion about Kashmir and self-determination was so successful here because we had, and we have in general, a very high concentration of political leaders. And the other small disturbing factor is that as a consequence of Brexit, the UK members of the European Parliament have left. Because of colonial reasons, UK members of the European Parliament.
Can I interrupt for a minute?
Please tell me.
Noise in the background.
The what? There
is a lot of noise in the background. Anyway, you can't avoid it. So
okay, now what I can do, I can come closer to the microphone? This might, okay. Now, and in the past, a lot of the solidarity work with Kashmir was done with and through the British members of the European Parliament. Now they have gone. Therefore, a new group has been created here with a German president, an Italian vice president, and Spanish Catalan other vice president. Manuela Rieper, MEP, Germany. Carles Puigdemont, you mentioned him before, the president of Catalonia, and Fabio Maximo Castaldo, who is a vice president of the whole of the European Parliament. These are the three leading members of this group here in the European Parliament, bringing permanently Kashmir on the agenda. We yesterday had here discussion in the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament on self-determination versus the question of non-violation of international borders. Why? Because we have the military conflict in the moment in the Caucasus. And if you look at the subject of self-determination, at a certain moment, it might come into conflict with the right that borders are there and shouldn't be questioned and shouldn't be destroyed on the benefit of whoever. The result of the discussion in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we'll see it in the plenary next week, it will be then officially, when we made official, is an immediate ceasefire. And that's the so-called Minsk group. That means representatives of 8 countries and the Organization of Security in Europe should intervene. But the general issue is, if you have these two principles, on the one hand, self-determination, you're all in favor of it. On the other hand, you can't question the borders all the time. It is worthwhile to think about this conflict. For me as a politician, for the politicians who are running around in Brussels and deciding in Brussels, I think they are more enshrined to support the principle of self-determination. Why? Because we are politicians to serve the people, to serve the population, that they are satisfied, that they feel free, that they feel accepted, that they have the feeling that their dignity is respected. For me as a German, dignity is a key word because the first noun in the Constitution of Germany is the dignity. That people feel happy and satisfied. And if self-determination is not guaranteed to a people, if people feel too alienated to the central power, there's protest. And the central power in general is fighting against this protest with uneven means. The result is human rights violations, not one or two, but general human rights violation. We heard it here today at the example of Kashmir. We heard it as well from the example of Palestine, arrest, torture, killing, and not only looking on adults, male, female, elderly, children, on the whole of the population. And therefore, I think even here in the European Parliament, where we always say borders, international borders, not ours, because we want to make our borders no longer important, but the international borders have to be respected. Here, there is a strong majority in favor of self-determination. And therefore, we will see it now, despite COVID, and then after COVID restrictions have been decreased, the European Parliament will continue to be a partner, a dedicated partner for the right of the Kashmiri people to determine their own future. And therefore, you will hear from us in the future a lot of positive things, because self-determination belongs to our catalogue of values. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. If you could mute yourself, then we will have less noise in the background, please. Well, thank you very much for that innovative presentation. Obviously, you gave the background how we work together on the Kashmir issue within the European Parliament. Obviously, Frank, 5th August 2019 onwards, it has been extremely difficult in Kashmir because of the lockdown. First, the military lockdown, and then obviously followed by the pandemic lockdown. And the situation still on the ground is terribly, terribly horrible. And for that matter, I think, and I believe, the situation in whole of India is horrible, both on the front of human rights. We have seen even yesterday a Dalit girl who was raped and then gang raped and then murdered. And the people who killed her are the Brahmins or Thakurs. And the way the body was disposed of and cremated by the UP police is in itself a very tragic situation. Therefore, whole of India is up today in protests. The way caste system is still prevailing in Gandhi's India even today. So not very surprised what is happening in Kashmir, therefore, because whole of India is in a very grim situation at the moment, because you have a fascist government in New Delhi, and then it's very unfortunate the way India is heading at this stage towards all minorities, or towards all non-Brahmin Hindus. Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you for your intervention. It's very nice to see Daniela back. For a very long time, she was not on the screen, but now that we are coming to conclude this session, we have one hidden speaker. She approached me very late last night. Frank knows her very well because she has been member of the European Parliament until, well, they left, to be quite honest, or their government decided that they no longer are required there. Julie Ward is another very socialist person, very much who holds social values in greatness, like our Dr. Ronka, and a very strong supporter of human rights situations anywhere in the world. But as long as she was in the European Parliament, she has done amazing work on Kashmir, and Frank is obviously witness to that. And she wanted obviously to be part of this deliberations today, but it was too late for her because she had other engagements, but nevertheless wished to send a goodwill message. And I think we have her video as well, and we will conclude with her message. I hope the technicians are listening to me, and if they could now run Julie Ward, former member of the European Parliament, goodwill message to the conference. Please.
I'd like to say hello to all my friends who are fighting for freedom and democracy for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. And I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in person or even virtually for this really important session at the UN Human Rights Council. And I appreciate the invitation to contribute to the ongoing discussions about this very long-running issue. There are many things at play here, and lots of twists and turns. And I'm glad that you're convening and that you're still bringing to attention specific concrete violations and threats to sustainable future. And that's because during this COVID crisis, many right-wing governments want to shut down opposition, discussion, dissent. They're using the pandemic as an excuse, really, to try and brush things under the carpet. So the fact that you're still fighting this noble cause of human rights and self-determination is really, really important. I've noted that the session is looking in particular at an environmental problem. And many people haven't twigged that Kashmir is a place that is full of incredible natural resources. And if given the opportunity, could provide for its people, for its citizens. But if those resources are polluted with toxic nuclear waste and other chemicals, then that viable future becomes more difficult. And in fact, environmental action is going up the agenda, not down, all around the world. Therefore, who are very frightened for their future. They're campaigning about climate change, they're campaigning about land appropriation, about waste, they're campaigning about fossil fuels, they're campaigning about nuclear. And so this issue is very important. It's important not just now, but it's important for the future generation who will be the leaders and the active citizens of a free Kashmir. So I'm pleased that you're having this meeting. I hope that you'll address some of the issues that I always address, which is about the gender aspects. I've talked about young people, and I know that they're very active and that you all care about them. And sometimes the conversations become very technical, and we forget that the victims of war and conflict are largely women and children. And so if there's no solution, we're going to continue having a terrible situation for the lives of my sisters in Kashmir. And I'm not going to give up the fight until there's a proper solution where the people of Jammu and Kashmir are able to choose their own destiny. So thank you for everything that you're doing, and thank you for being specific and concrete by bringing this most recent issue about despoilation to our attention.
Well, you heard her. Thank you very much, Julie. It's very important to relate it to why she raised the environmental issues. And she has been a great fighter of environmental issues. Again, Frank would know it better than me. Throughout, she has been. We did discuss very recently, and I think my great friend there, Ambassador Barnes, in fact, raised the issue in one of his interventions physically in the Palais des Nations, is the chemical waste, nuclear waste that is taking place in a very remote area of Kashmir, which is very well known, and most of you will probably know Siachen glaciers. Siachen glaciers are probably the biggest glaciers around the world, but they are melting. They are melting. Why? Because there is nearly 300 tons wrong. It was something around that, 300 tons of waste every year in that part of the world, in the glaciers, because the Indian Army is on the highest peak of the world there. And whatever they find from their army ammunitions and everything, they dispose of, they dispose it off on the glaciers, as a result of which Siachen glaciers are melting, and that's having enormous effect on the Jammu and Kashmir climate and environment. But that's what she was referring to. But anyway, that brings us to a close now. What can I say other than that you have been a wonderful panel. We miss both Alfred being here and Julie being here, but all of you, Ron, Frank, Daniela, of course, Joseph, and of course, Nazir Ahmad Shaw. Thank you for your wonderful contributions. Thank you for your wonderful thoughts. It will be recorded. We are going to prepare a summary of it and possibly, and then forward it to the President of the Human Rights Council and also to the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Very grateful to you, very grateful to make your time for this side event and being throughout part of it. Thank you very much. With these words, I conclude this conference, and thank you and bye-bye to everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Majid.